45A is the right fingernail clippings. 1B refers to nearby blood on the same nail.
Okay. And would you describe, starting from left to right, 45B, what results did you obtain with the D1S80 marker when you typed your number 45B?
Those are all single-banded patterns of 18 homozygotes.
And that's consistent with Nicole Brown?
Yes, it is.
Could we use, I think we've been using green for the 18 allele. Could you put an arrow for each of the 3 samples that gave you the same result, the 18 allele? Is there any question in your mind that they're the same result for all 3 of those samples?
No.
Okay. Then we capture that, Your Honor, as 275G1.
Yes.
And the last board and results, if we can keep the Bundy result board up there and put the Bundy photo board, which is People's Exhibit 165 up there. At the same time, I'd like to have marked as People's 275H for identification, gel AG295. What I'd like to talk about is items 115, 116, and 117, so as not to confuse them with photo ID numbers, which are in the upper left-hand corner and then just down below it, the items from the rear gate at Bundy.
Okay.
And you performed D1S80 typing on those samples as well?
Yes, I did.
And could you please describe your results, and then I'll ask you to mark them, if you will.
Yes, these all came back 24, 25. And as you can see,
We're using red for 24, 25. Why don't you mark 115? Have we marked 275H on the record?
Yes, we have 275H. It's AG295.
Thank you. So that's a 2425.
yes, it is.
Okay, and we can move over to 116 and describe the results that you obtained on 116.
On 116, it's also a 24, 25.
Okay, we put arrows that show where those bands are. Okay, and on the 117, the rear gate stain, could you describe the results and put arrows to show where they are?
Yes, the same results were obtained with sample 117, and that's a 24 allele and a 25.
And are those results, or strike that, is 115 consistent with Mr. Simpson's D1S80 type?
Yes, it is.
Is 116 consistent with Mr. Simpson's D1S80 type?
Yes, it
Is
is.
117 consistent with Mr. Simpson's D1S80 type?
Yes, it is.
Are those three types, the three results, 115, 116, 117, are they consistent with one another?
Yes, they are.
Are all three of those results inconsistent with having come from Ronald Goldman alone?
Well, yes, because by looking at the D1S80 results and also by looking at the DQ alpha results, there's no indication that a mixture is present here. And so on this, the type of the individual would be a 24-25.
And is Nicole Brown excluded as a source of those stains?
Yes, there was no 18 allele detected on any of these stains.
Your Honor, could we capture that as 275H1?
Yes.
Now, did anything happen in the course of your testing on all the samples that you've tested in this case that undermines your confidence in the results that both you and Mr. Sims have been presenting?
No.
And as I mentioned, there are a number of other films that have not been shown to the jury.
That's correct.
Okay. Thanks, Ms. Montgomery. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a brief recess to recycle the exhibits and allow Mr. Blasier some opportunity to look at some items. I'll ask you just to step back into the jury room, and we'll buzz you out in probably about 10 or 15 minutes. All right? Thank you.
Now that they forced us to try to put things on our result boards, why don't we put who they could be from then? I think that would be fair and consistent, Your Honor, to put what it is, not what it's not, because then you
And
get...
what do you suggest?
Well, that's where it gets a little convoluted, because there are all sorts of mixtures or single stains. I can go down the list, but that's the point. To say what it's not doesn't mean anything. To say what it is provides the proper context for it. I can go down the list if you'd like.
Well, it's your record, counsel.
Okay. Well, I think it's argumentative to say that there are no matches or however they want to describe it, because that ignores what it is. They can clearly say that in argument, but this is not the point to start preaching your argument.
Well, let me ask a question. Is this dealing just with the clothing, or
Just the clothing, yes.
just the clothing?
We can change that to OJS excluded. I mean, this is from their test results.
Well, I thought this wasn't the time for argument in your exhibits. I mean, that's what the court has consistently ruled
Yes.
when we've had to modify almost every one of our boards, and a statement is a statement. An argument about what it's not is an argument.
This is their results. He's excluded from all the stains on the clothing. That's all it says.
Do you agree with that?
Did
With
he-
regards to the clothing, not the glove, the clothing.
Sure, but you know, how you say it, I mean, we have results. The results say who they could be from. I'm assuming this is in the context of the series of slides. It's the last slide, and it is the summary of the sum total of stains that were tested. But it's still argumentative. That's, in fact, the final outcome of this process. But this...
All right. Mr. Blasier, I'm going to direct you to add summary results, Ray clothing, victim's clothing, that the term carryover be changed to mixtures, plural. And you can put defendant excluded.
I can.
Yeah. All right. With regards to the D1S80 results, Rockingham glove, Mr. Harmon, do you have any objections to this?
It's going to be worded.
The-
They're supposed to point out where the stains are. So since this is in a sequence of slides, it's hard to appreciate
Mhm.
what it's supposed to demonstrate. Would you
All right.
like?
My concern, Mr. Blasier, is with the second glove slide, where you have no genotypes consistent with OJS, and that does not appear to be correct from the evidence that's here.
I think the only stain that has alleles consistent with Mr. Simpson are in the wrist area, those three, G, 10, 11, and 13. They're mixtures of consistent with Mr. Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson in the body of the glove, but nothing consistent with Mr. Simpson.
Is the idea that you're trying to convey here is that the wrist area is the only area where you have something consistent with, and then for the remainder of the glove, it's not consistent?
Correct. Then all the tests done on the rest of the glove, he's excluded.
All right, any other comment?
Well, yeah, it'd be nice if we had overnight to look at these, so we don't have to struggle with them now, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
I know it's cross-examination, but he had them yesterday. I mean, we could avoid this stuff, so. You know, this says it all. This is a photograph of the gloves. One of them's on the inside, and the others are on the outside. And this just has a circle around the cuff of the glove, Your Honor.
It's as simple as I could make it. Every time I put more stuff on there, I'd get objected to.
It may be simple, but it's not accurate. Sometimes they
How is it
deviate.
inaccurate?
You know.
How is it inaccurate?
All right, Mr. Harris, can you make these corrections? All right.
On the last slide, rather than defendant excluded, can we say OJS excluded?
Yes.
See, I mean, it's just one side of the glove, Your Honor. There's two sides to it.
I understand. All right, any other comment? Mr. Harmon?
Just that it oversimplifies something and it's misleading. I mean, we have actual photographs of it that actually depict where they are, and to force somebody to say, yeah, that's right, when it's not, I don't think we do anybody a service with that.
All right. All right, with the corrections ordered by the court, the other objections will be overruled. All right, let's have the jurors, please. I'm talking to Mr. Blasier.
We had two additional films that should be included in the,
Hold on just a second.
I'm sorry.
All right. Good morning again, Ms. Montgomery. You're reminded you're still under oath. And Mr. Harmon, I'm sorry, I thought you had completed your direct examination.
Well, we noticed there were two additional films, so we should go up to T then, 275T.
All right, 275T. Mrs. Robertson, do you have that? All right, thank you. All right, good morning, Mr. Blasier.
Good morning, Your Honor.
All right, you may commence your cross-examination.
Ms. Montgomery, good morning.
Good morning, Mr.
Folks,
Blasier.
good morning. Ms. Montgomery, when Mr. Harmon was asking you questions about various stains, he was describing the locations where those stains were purportedly obtained from. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Now, you have no personal knowledge of those descriptions were accurate, do you?
No, as I stated, Mr. Sims looked at the samples that came into the lab, and then I did the analysis for D1S80.
And of course, he doesn't have any personal knowledge either, does he? He was not out at the scene collecting evidence.
No, he was not.
And nobody from Department of Justice, to your knowledge, was out there actually collecting and preserving evidence, correct?
Correct.
And so you have no way of personally verifying that the evidence was collected properly or processed properly before it came to your lab. Is that correct?
I was not at the crime scene, no.
So you basically, you take what is sent to you, and you can account for what happens once you get it, but you can't really say a whole lot about what might have happened to it before.
Correct.
Okay. I want to ask you a couple of questions about your notes. Your notes were provided to us in Discovery, were they not?
Yes, they were.
Now, you write your notes in ink,
Yes, I do.
and all of your pages are numbered sequentially, are they not?
Yes, they are.
And you number those as you go along, correct?
Yes, I do.
And when you're done with a block of pages, you go back and actually put page 2 of 70, page 3 of 70, page 4 of 70, do you not?
Well, when I go back, since I number them at the time I'm making the notes, what I do is I go back and I count how many total pages. In this case, there was over 100 pages just for my analysis. And so I'll just write of or slash with the total on the bottom.
And that's so that you can ensure in your own mind that you're accounting for all of your work papers, correct?
Correct.
And anybody else that's looking at your work papers can tell how many pages they're supposed to be, how many pages there are.
Right.
And your handwriting's pretty easy to read, is it not?
I find it easy to read.
When you make a correction, you don't erase anything, you line it out, and you put your initials on it, correct?
Right.
And that's all standard laboratory procedures at the Department of Justice, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And those are just good techniques that you've learned as a criminalist, correct?
Well, actually, I learned them prior to being a criminalist, yes.
And in fact, you don't even leave any space at the bottom of a page. You draw a box or an X if you finish something and there's still room on the page, correct?
I like to try to do that. There are occasions when I don't. It's just to let me know that nothing else has been written on that page at that time.
And is it accurate to say that one of the reasons for all of these safeguards that you use is so nobody can come in and change your notes or add something without you knowing about it?
Well, no, I think it's more for, first of all, the numbering is so I know how many pages there are in the order of my notes. And also then when I get into court, so I can easily refer to a certain page and see the sequence of events there. And as far as crossing out, it's just so I'm aware that nothing else was written on that page that day and just ending the page.
Is it accurate that one of the ideas of doing your notes as thoroughly as you do is that at some point in the future when you may get called to court, you want to be able to sit down and reconstruct everything important that you did on a particular case?
Yes.
And furthermore, another important reason for doing it that way is that if for some reason you had changed employment or changed professions or something like that, another analyst could sit down with your notes and basically reconstruct everything you did on a particular test.
Correct.
Would you agree that it's not good procedure for you if you get called into court to have to say you don't remember something because you didn't write it down?
Well, it depends on what that is.
Any important steps that you do in a particular test, if you say I don't remember because I didn't write it down, that's not very effective on your part, is it?
Objections are relevant.
Sustained.
Ms. Montgomery, I want to ask you just a few questions about your background. Mr. Harmon asked you about undergraduate courses that related to DNA, and I didn't think you said any. Was I accurate in that?
Yes, I think I jumped right into post-graduation courses. I didn't discuss the courses that I took as an undergrad, but some of those courses were biochemistry, in which DNA was discussed. Also in my environmental toxicology courses, DNA was discussed in several of those courses.
In what context?
In the context of like mode of action, how chemicals reacted on humans or animals, and so it was discussed on how the DNA was affected by certain chemicals in the environment or that were produced by chemical companies.
Did anything in your undergraduate background cover forensic applications of DNA technology?
No.
Now, you indicated Now, did any of your graduate courses involve forensic applications of DNA technology?
Well, as far as graduate courses, there was only, well, actually, two of the courses I took post-graduation, I received graduate units for. The others were under or upper division courses, but not graduate courses. And the ones that I obtained, graduate units, were the FBI Academy class through the University of Virginia, and that was 6 units of graduate course, and that was the forensic application of DNA technology, and also the laboratory course. And then also 1 unit of graduate level units was given in the DNA sequencing course through the University of Northern Colorado.
Now, your genetics course in 1992 at Cal State Hayward, that didn't deal with forensic applications of DNA technology, did it?
No.
How about your 2 semesters in molecular biology at Berkeley, 92 and 93? Did that deal with forensic applications of DNA technology at all?
I'm not quite sure if it went over. The instructor of the course had an interest in forensics and the application of DNA technology to forensics, but I don't recall if he actually had a lecture on it or not.
Now, that particular course, I think you indicated that there was no hands-on work in that course.
That's correct.
Your training at Quantico, did that involve any study or applications or casework dealing with D1S80?
I believe they talked about amphlips, which the amplified fragment length polymorphisms, in the PCR section, but the course was not devoted to D1S80 analysis. But they did talk about the PCR technique.
But specifically it relates to D1S80. That wasn't really a focus of that course, was it?
It was not the focus of the course.
Did you have any hands-on work at all at the Quantico course?
Yes, I had hands-on.
Any involving D1S80?
No.
Any involving DQ alpha?
Yes.
And how much hands-on work did you have there?
Half of the course was devoted to the laboratory aspect of DNA analysis, and the other half was devoted to lectures. So approximately 2 weeks, maybe a little less than 2 weeks in total of that 4 weeks was devoted to the laboratory aspect of DNA analysis.
And approximately how many individual tests did you do at that time? Just approximately.
Oh, I don't recall.
More than 3?
No, I can't imagine it was more than 3.
Now, your statistics course in the fall of '93 at Berkeley, did that have anything to do with the forensic applications of DNA technology?
No, but that instructor was also interested in the application of forensics and how statistics was applied to forensic issues. And so he would discuss in passing just some of the forensic applications and how statistics related to that.
And how about your course in DNA sequencing in the summer of '94 at the University of Colorado? Was that dealing with forensic applications of DNA technology?
Well, the instructor of that course was Dr. Steve Lee, and he's a researcher at our laboratory. And so he did discuss forensic applications. But the focus of the class was DNA sequencing, just in general.
Is it fair to say that, that all of your background, with the exception of the Quantico training course and what you've talked about with the California Criminalistics Institute, didn't really focus on forensic applications of DNA technology to any great extent?
My classroom, my formal classroom training, is that
And these courses that we've talked about at Colorado, at Berkeley?
Yes, as far as the formal classroom training, the credited, or I mean, I guess I should say credited, not formal, those involved just the theory. But then the courses that I took that weren't credited, such as the course through the California Criminalistics Institute on PCR, that was devoted to DNA analysis and its forensic aspects.
Now, you listed some of the courses that you took under general criminalistics, and I wrote those down as basic microscopy, zone electrophoresis, sexual assault, low explosives, clandestine labs, arson investigations, and basic serology. Is that a pretty complete list?
Yes, I believe that's the extent.
Would you agree that all of those, with the exception of perhaps zone electrophoresis, deal with things other than forensic applications of DNA technology?
Correct.
And your 1989 course in crime scene investigations that you took in Eureka, did that have anything to do with DNA technology?
No, it was a crime scene investigation course, so reconstruction and collection of evidence.
I'm sorry.
I'm done.
And your firearm safety course in '89, that didn't have anything to do with DNA, did it?
No.
Have you written any, you have any publications that deal with DNA technology?
No, I don't.
Now, when you went to work at Modesto in 1988, that was an arm of the Department of Justice?
Yes, the Modesto is a satellite laboratory. It's a full-service criminalistics laboratory.
And you were there for 3 years?
Right.
Did you do anything relating to forensic applications of DNA technology during that 3 years?
No, not hands-on. At that time, I was interested in DNA, the use of DNA in forensics, and so I would keep up to date on what was going on in the DNA field.
But you had no practical experience at all?
No.
Now, when you went to Stockton in 1991, again, you were doing things other than DNA, forensic applications of DNA technology, correct?
Correct.
So that didn't provide you with any relevant experience to what you're doing now? Relative.
Well, as far
relevance.
as DNA analysis, that's correct.
Okay. Now, finally, in 1992, you moved to the DNA lab in Berkeley.
Right.
When you moved there, did you go there with the intention of working in forensic DNA technology areas?
Yes, I did. The field was changing from conventional serology to DNA analysis, and since I was very interested in DNA analysis from early on, I decided the best place to gain more experience and to actually work with the technology was at the Berkeley laboratory.
And at what point did you get assigned to, you were put in charge of setting up the D1S80 program?
Two individuals, myself and Richard Showalter, were to work together in the development of a system, the D1S80 system.
And when was that about, approximately?
That was, I believe Richard started it in June, the summer of '94, so I think he began around June with the technique, and then when I got back from the FBI Academy, I worked with him, and we worked together in the development of that system.
When you were assigned that responsibility, had you ever done a D1S80 test?
Done a,
D1S80 test?
no, I had not.
You know, perhaps this might be a good time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our break for the lunch recess. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess until 1 p.m. All right, Ms. Montgomery, you may step down. Your order to return 1 p.m.
Where there's no CDOT and they're inconclusive, and I wanted to make a time with the court as to maybe at the end of the day or whenever we could take up these matters.
I have the feeling we're going to finish with Ms. Montgomery today.
Yes, we should, and that's why I was hoping that we could take up those other matters, and
All right.
perhaps we can finish all these witnesses this week.
All right. Good. All right, let's have the jurors, please. The members of our jury panel, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All right, Ms. Montgomery, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, good afternoon, Ms. Montgomery.
Good afternoon.
You're reminded, ma'am, you are still under oath, and Mr. Blasier, you may continue with your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, folks. Ms. Montgomery?
Mr. Williams.
When we broke for lunch, we were talking about your level of experience with the D1S80 system. When the program started at DOJ, was there anyone at DOJ that had any experience at all with D1S80?
Yes, Dr. Nora Rudin had looked at some of the gel systems, I believe it was back in 1990, and that was for a brief period. And at that time, our lab decided to focus on other things, and so the project was dropped. Dr. Nora Rudin was a researcher at our laboratory.
And that's the extent of the experience of everybody in your lab with D1S80 prior to when you started, when you were in charge of the program setting it up?
Correct.
Now, the period of time from when you started to set up this program until it was actually implemented in casework was 8 months?
Yes, it was. We started in, well, actually, it was a little over 8 months. We started in, like I said, around June of '94, and then began casework in April, or June of '93, and then began casework in April of '94.
Is there any requirement at all that a new marker system, such as D1S80 or a new technique, have any kind of government approval at all to assure that it's a valid system?
Government approval?
Yes.
No, but there are guidelines that are set up that must be met, and some of these guidelines are, well, actually, these guidelines are addressed under TWIGDAM. And TWIGDAM's the Technical Working Group on DNA Analysis and Methods. And they set up criteria that must be addressed.
Excuse me, Ms. Montgomery, the actual question was regarding government.
Okay.
There is no government approval process required at all, is there?
No, there's not.
And you're aware that with clinical testing involving new DNA techniques, they require extensive governmental regulation and approval by the FDA.
Objections are relevant and insufficient foundation.
Sustained.
But there's no such approval process like that required for a new system such as D1S80.
No such approval is made.
Sustained.
You indicated TWIGDAM that there are guidelines that you must follow. TWIGDAM is a voluntary program, isn't it?
I believe, well, in our laboratory, it's not a voluntary program. It's something that must be followed. The guidelines have to be followed, first of all, for accreditation purposes, and also because our laboratory believes in TWIGDAM guidelines.
There's no enforcement mechanism, however, is there, if you don't follow the guidelines? Are you aware of any?
I'm not aware of any.
And TWIGDAM is a voluntary, you can run your lab without complying with TWIGDAM, can't you?
I'm not quite sure.
Oh,
So you're not sure whether TWIGDAM is mandatory or not, in terms of you being governed by someone other than yourselves?
No, I'm not.
Now, the D1S80 system is really the newest system compared to DQ alpha, polymarkers, and RFLP, is it not?
Well, compared to those three, yes, but there are other techniques that are being looked at this time.
There are other techniques that are even newer than D1S80, aren't there?
I'm sorry, not techniques, I mean markers. Because the technique in general is the PCR technique, but it's actually the marker that's the new part of it.
Well, but this is, you described it as a marriage between RFLP and PCR. It's a different system than just PCR and just RFLP, isn't it?
Correct. It's incorporating the two techniques into one.
And just as it might have the strengths of both systems, it also has the weaknesses of both systems put together.
Objection, no foundation, this is maximum evidence.
sustained.
Any indication that it works any better than PCR DQ alpha or any better than RFLP?
Well, I believe that all three of these systems are equally reliable and can give reproducible results. I don't see any of them as being better than the other as far as obtaining results. The difference is, as Dr. Cotton and Mr. Sims stated, is with the RFLP that you need larger amounts of samples and et cetera.
You're aware of the areas of PCR technology where there can be problems such as contamination, are you not?
Yes, we're always concerned with contamination.
And that applies with D1S80, does it not?
Yes, it does.
Because it is a PCR process.
Correct.
So it has all of the potential problems that DQ alpha testing has, does it not?
Correct. As far as sensitivity and contamination, yes.
Now, with respect to the RFLP half of it, does it have some of the limitations that RFLP has with respect to the size of a sample that you need?
No, it doesn't. And I guess I need to clarify how I meant by incorporating both RFLP and PCR. By incorporating the RFLP, by the marriage of it, we're looking at these repetitive sequences. And so just to clarify that issue, that's how it's similar to the RFLP process. As far as your question, I'm sorry, could you restate your question?
I think you answered it. Now, as being responsible for setting up this program, you're required or responsible for reviewing all of the relevant literature pertaining to D1S80, are you not?
Yes, I reviewed the literature.
And did you spend a considerable amount of time doing that to make sure that you understood the technology?
Yes.
And do you still keep up with that?
Yes, I do.
Would you agree with that with respect to D1S80, there's much, much less literature on it than there is, for instance, RFLP?
Yes, that's true.
And there's much, much less literature than there is with PCR DQ alpha, correct?
That's correct.
It has been used in casework much less than PCR DQ alpha and RFLP, correct?
Yes, DQ alpha's been around since 1986 or so.
And during the course of your work at DOJ, you've only worked on 20 cases, I believe. Is that what you said, approximately?
Yes, approximately 20 cases. Each case involves more than just one sample, though.
And how many cases does your lab approximately handle in a year?
Counsel, you want to, we're talking DNA cases?
DNA cases.
Well, our laboratory is not known for quick turnaround time. We tend to be a bit slow at doing cases. So each analyst does approximately 2 cases a month. That's what we strive for. And in our lab currently, we only have I'd say 4.5 individuals doing cases. So in the past year, this would just be a guess, but let's say probably around
100?
80 to 100 cases.
And so that in the 20 cases that you've worked on, is that all of the D1S80 cases?
No, it's not.
Would it be fair to say that the D1S80 cases are a relatively small percentage of the total cases that DOJ handles with DNA testing?
Well, anytime there's a small amount of sample, both the DQ alpha and the D1S80 system would be used, unless the individual is excluded on one of the systems, and then the other system wouldn't be used at that time. So anytime we have the capability of using both systems will be used. If it's an RFLP case, then typically we only do the RFLP and we don't do the PCR typing.
Now, Cellmark doesn't do D1S80, do they?
No, they don't.
As of August of last year, had Department of Justice reported or testified about any D1S80 results in any case anywhere?
Yes.
How many? Approximately.
Well, I know of one case, and that's a case that I did in, I believe it was the summer last year, in '94. I don't recall if any other cases were, if any of the other analysts have testified to D1S80.
So all you can recall, I'm sorry.
So at this time, all I can recall is the one case that I've done.
Now, you were asked some questions about proficiency testing, and I think you indicated that you had been involved in 5 proficiency tests,
Yes.
all D1S80?
Actually, if I could review a document, I
Sure.
can answer that for you. And I believe this is a document that you've obtained on discovery.
And how many of those proficiency tests involve D1S80?
4 of the 5 involved D1S80.
And you indicated that you got those all right.
Correct.
And what does that mean? Does that mean that you got the type that was expected that you get?
Yes, that means that the results that were reported out by the laboratory were the expected results.
Now, are these blind tests? Do you know you're being tested?
Yes, we know we're being tested.
And who prepares the samples?
Prepares them to send out to our laboratory?
No, yeah. Are those prepared in-house?
No, these proficiencies are prepared externally. We subscribe to 2 systems. One is CTS and another one is Cellmark. And we also have in-house proficiencies that have to be done too.
But these 5, or the 4 that related to D1S80, were they externally provided or internally provided?
Yes, they were externally provided.
But you knew you were being tested.
Correct.
Did you know what the results were supposed to be?
No, I didn't.
Let me show you.
All right, with the court reporter.
Yes, I do.
And those are, that's just one proficiency test, is it not? It was rehybridized twice or a second time?
Yes, this is one proficiency test.
So you're testing the same samples in both of those worksheets,
Correct.
but you're doing a different hybridization. Those represent 2 different hybridizations.
Yes, and there are some different samples.
Okay. And I'd like to have these marked.
Mrs. Robertson. All right, 1172.
1172 A and B, or?
Yeah, A and B.
I'd like to put 1172A on the envelope first. Chris? Ms. Montgomery, the 2 pages I showed you, one was numbered page 6 of 9, and the other was page 8 of 9. You recall that?
I'd have to look at it again.
Essentially, I want you to tell me which one of these you did first.
Well, actually, that's not my writing at the top of the page. My writing's at the bottom, and I can't tell the whole. It hasn't been Xeroxed completely.
Can you tell from your own notes?
Well, this is a proficiency. This isn't something that I brought to court with me today.
Okay.
But it appears that one says 14 of 22 and the other says 19 of, and there's a 2, so if I could see the original documents or a better copy, that would be even better. But just by looking at it, it appears that the 14 of 22, the other one's trying to say 19 of 22 maybe.
Let me show you the rest of the documents that those pages came from, see if that helps you.
Yeah, it appears that this second page is probably part of the same document. It has the same proficiency number and it also has a date 2 days later. So
Okay.
this is the first one that has the date of the 18th of October, and the second one would be the 20th of October.
All right, for the record, she's referring to 1172A is the first one, and 1172B is the second one.
Thank you.
Well, let's look at 1172A. Let me give you the rest of this packet in case you need to refer to it.
And do you also have the original or a copy of the photos that go with these?
I don't believe you do. Now, this is the worksheet, what we have up in the Elmo is the worksheet that describes what results you saw after you performed the test, correct?
You know, this multimedia, I can't decide what to look at.
Whatever's easiest.
You know, the clarity's not very good on this, so maybe if I came down there, it would be easy for me to see.
Sure.
Okay.
Can we pull it in a little bit to the 432-51? Right there, that's good. 432-51, that line refers to one of the samples that was provided in the proficiency test, correct?
Actually, that's dash S. That's an S.
Okay. That's one of the samples you were supposed to type and get a result, correct?
Correct.
And QC 839, in the middle of the screen there, toward the bottom, what's that?
That's a quality control. What would be more helpful is if I had the whole file on this. It's difficult just to take this all out of context to actually see what the notes are prior to the samples being written on here. Because a lot of times what you want to do, when you talk about sample, you can't write everything that pertains to that particular sample. So you write a certain section in that sample. And then in your the body of your notes, you write a little more description.
What you write in the little boxes there is what you see on the dots. Or,
I'm sorry, I'm talking about the sample lane.
Okay. Now, this is actually a DQ alpha proficiency test, correct?
Correct.
And what you write in the boxes there is what you see on the dots, correct?
Correct. Now you're over to the dots.
Yeah. On QC 839, do you see where it says there's a hint of a 1.3?
Yes, I see that.
That's not the correct result for QC 839, is it?
No, that must be the correct result because this goes through approval. We have this approval process where, first of all, a second reader reads the strips, and then the results are given to a supervisor to review the whole case. And the QCs are unknown to us. And the supervisor reviews the results of your QC. And if you And they check to make sure those QCs are giving the proper results. If the QC doesn't give the proper results, then something needs to be done.
The box under type, that's the type of that quality control sample, is it not?
Correct.
And that's indicated as a 1.1, comma 3, correct?
Right.
Nothing in there about a 1.3, is there?
Oh, no, because that's a hint. It's,
What's a hint?
a hint is just an indication of some, I believe Gary Sims talked to you yesterday or the day about, or a couple days ago about this. When you look at the DQ alpha strips where there are a series of the dots, and next to the 1.3, in this case, if I wrote that there's a hint, then there was some outline or a hint of some activity seen at that dot, but it was significantly less than the C dot. So it was, it had to be documented, but it wasn't significant to the analysis. When in our laboratories, things need to be C or greater before they're actually called.
If this were a mixture, however, you interpret mixtures where you have dots less than the C dot as being alleles, don't you?
Dots less than the C dot?
Yes.
If you see a C dot, then you do report that out. As far as a C minus or a trace or a hint, you note it, but as far as any interpretation, one needs to be cautious about interpretation on that.
You're not supposed to see anything at the 1.3 dot with a quality control sample that's a 1.13, are you?
That's argumentative.
Sustain. Rephrase question.
Are you supposed to see anything in the 1.3 dot with a quality control sample that it's a 1.1 and a 3?
Well, if you shouldn't see a substantial amount of activity at that 1.3 if that is a 1.1, comma 3. It's one of the limitations of the system. At the 1.3, you could get cross-hybridization. And this is where a sequence that's complementary or to the 1.3 will actually cause some cause some of the 1.3 dot to show up. But this is just an artifact of the system, and at such a low level, one wouldn't even interpret that result.
So you can get 1.3 dots when there's nothing there.
When there's no,
What-
Vegas, the dots.
When there's,
Argumentative.
let me rephrase it. You can get a 1.3 dot when there's no DNA there?
it's not a dot that would be interpretable. As I stated, that's a hint. It's not a C dot. The intensity is substantially less than that C dot.
What's the difference between a hint and a trace?
We have in our laboratory, we have a scale of progression on how to call these dots. An outline hint means there's you could see something on the strip, but it's just a small amount. A trace is a little more, and then there's a C minus, and then a C, and then a C plus.
What's a trace? Is a trace indication of some DNA there?
A trace is a little more than a hint, but once again, it's not significant for the analysis. It just happens to be an artifact or a limitation of the system, or not a limitation, an artifact of the system. A trace would not be interpreted in the results.
What's the difference between a system that gives you artifacts and a system that has limitations that gives you an artifact?
Action, that's argumentative compound.
Oral.
As you indicated, it wasn't a limitation of the system.
Right.
Whose fault is it that you get dots at 1.3 when there's no DNA there?
Action, that's argumentative.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Are the 1.3 dots caused by limitations in the system or something else?
Well, it's caused by a little of both. And what happens, these are not significant dots. They're hints and traces. They would not be counted in your interpretation. But what happens is with slight variations in the typing, some trace amounts of 1.3 activity can be seen on the strips. And I guess one could say it's a limitation, as Mr. Blasier says, but also it's an artifact of the system. And if it was something these dots are so faint and so weak that, you know, as I have said, it just wouldn't be counted in your interpretation.
It could also be a minor component of a mixture that has a 1.3 in a small quantity in it, couldn't it?
It could be, but it wouldn't be interpreted at that level.
And is there some sort of uniform scale within the forensic community by which you determine the difference between a hint and a trace?
No.
Does it have anything to do with the results that you expect to get out of a test as to whether you're going to call it a hint or a trace or a C minus?
Actually, that's arguable.
No.
Now, the positive control, the lane second from the bottom, that was supposed to be a 1.14, correct? That's what the type that was put in that lane, correct?
That is a 1.1, 4.
Now, you got a trace of a 1.3 in that lane, correct?
Correct.
And that's more than the hint in the quality control sample.
Yes, it is. As I said on our scale of progression, a trace is slightly greater than a hint.
Now, are you supposed to get these kinds of traces and hints when you perform tests? Are they expected?
No, they're not.
So this is an unexpected result, is it not?
This is something that it's not unexpected. I think unexpected is a bad word to use with it. It's something, as I said, it's just an artifact of the system, and by doing reanalysis, you could probably get rid of those hints and traces.
Okay, let's talk about the reanalysis, which is the page 2, correct?
Correct.
This is 1172B. Now, you did this one again, the one we just looked at, and the sheet that's on the Elmo is the results of the second run or second hybridization on the same samples. Is that correct?
Yes, some of the samples are the same.
Why did you run it the second time?
I'd have to see the notes to know why.
Is there anything in that packet there that tells you?
No.
Ordinarily, what would be your reason for running a proficiency test a second time?
There could be various reasons. I think I'd need to see my actual notes to be able to explain why I reran this a second time.
Would one reason be the hints and the traces that you got the first time?
It actually calls for speculation.
Sustain.
If the results that you got on the first run were totally as expected, would you have any reason to run it a second time?
It actually calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Well, that's possible. You know, I would need to see the actual, to speculate on this, or it's best not to speculate. It's best to actually see my notes in this particular instance.
Okay, now these are your notes with respect to how you read the strips, correct?
Right.
Now let's look at 432S1, the top lane. That's the first one. Now, would you agree that you found that there was a hint at 1.3 and a hint at 1.1 that was unexpected?
Once again, by saying unexpected, I think you're putting more emphasis on it than you should. I did notice hints in both of those samples, and once again, the hint is not significant to the results of that analysis.
So these are hints that show up now on the same sample that didn't show up the first time you did it, correct?
Could you put the first one back up?
You've got the first one in your hand.
Oh, you're right. Yes. Yes.
They did not show up the first time, did they?
Correct.
Now in 433S2, we've got a trace at 1.1 and a trace at 1.3 that don't conform to the genotype of the sample, which is 1.2, 3, correct?
Correct.
And that didn't show up the first time you did that sample, did it?
That's correct.
434S3, we now have a trace at 1.1 that is not consistent with the type of that sample, which is a 4, correct?
Right.
Now, quality control sample 839, we have two hints that are inconsistent with the genotype of that quality control, correct?
Well, no, they're not inconsistent with the genotype of that quality control. I have to keep emphasizing that a hint is not significant. A hint is just noting that something, you're seeing a little darkening in the dot, and it's not significant to your interpretation. The results of that QC are 1.1, 3, and those were the correct results.
Isn't one of the tests of whether a system like this is a reliable system, whether or not if you do the same samples 2 times, you're supposed to get the same results, aren't you?
Yes, and as you can see in this case, the same results were obtained.
Okay, you can resume your seat. So is it fair to say that this one particular proficiency test that we've looked at is an example of one which has been scored in some fashion that you got the right answers?
Yes, the right results were obtained from that proficiency.
Who grades these?
Excuse me?
Who grades these?
Grades them. Individuals review them. First of all, a supervisor in the laboratory would review the results, and then secondly, the outside agency that submitted the samples to us would review our results and then send out a result whether we obtained the correct results or not.
Do you know what a laminar flow hood is?
Yes, I do.
And do you use that performing any kind of PCR amplification, the various steps that you perform in that test, do you do them within a laminar flow hood?
Yes, I do the setup of the amplification in a laminar flow hood.
Would you ever use a hood that is called a flume hood, I believe, that sucks air from the outside of the lab into the area of the hood and then out?
Sustained.
Laminar flow hood, is that something that's pretty standard in terms of your education as a criminalist, that you're taught what that is and how to use it?
Oh,
Well, it's just a hood that has airflow in it, a window of air that separates the inside environment from the outside environment. And there's really not much training on it. You just turn the switch on to activate the hood.
But you're taught what a laminar flow hood is, aren't you?
I don't recall being taught. It's just something that I'm aware of, something that I'm familiar with.
The kits that you use to perform DQ alpha and D1S80 tests require that you do them in a laminar flow hood, don't they?
sustained. First question.
The kits that you use that are provided by Roche that produces the kits state that various steps should be done in a laminar flow hood.
I'm not quite sure. I don't recall seeing that in there. If you could show me the section.
Have any of the proficiency tests that you've taken involved mixed blood stains?
No, I don't believe so.
Most of the, or many of the stains that you looked at in this case, your test results indicated could be mixed stains, correct?
Some of them, yes.
And so you've never undergone any kind of testing to see whether you're able to do mixed blood stains accurately?
No, that's incorrect.
What kind of testing have you undergone for that?
I've a part of the validation process of the D1S80 marker, I looked at mixed samples, and these were both mixed, they were mixed DNAs. So not actually the mixed blood stained together, but the DNA, or an extraction process where the two DNAs were mixed together. And I looked at that during the validation process in use in our laboratory. And I believe that's the only, those are the mixed bloods that were examined. There are mixed samples that are examined also in the laboratory, and this sexual assault samples, vaginal swabs where you'll have epithelial cells, and then if there's sperm present also.
But there are no proficiency tests that you've taken that involve mixed samples of blood, are there?
Well, I was just looking at this as you were, or as I was talking, and it's one of the proficiencies I did was a blood semen mix. And that was a cell mark proficiency. And so that's where some of the blood and semen was mixed together. It wasn't two blood stains, but it was two different samples mixed together, and one of them happened to be a blood stain.
Well, without getting into any detail, sexual assault samples are different than mixed blood samples, aren't they?
Right, but this, correct.
You have other methods that you can use, a differential lysis, to split them apart, can't you?
Correct.
Which you can't do with bloodstains.
Right.
Incidentally, did you perform any kind of analysis on any of the stains that you looked at under the microscope to determine whether you could tell if there was a saliva component to any of these mixed stains?
No, as I stated earlier, Mr. Sims looked at all the evidence initially, and I did the D1S80 or DQ alpha analysis on the samples after he examined the samples.
So you have no way of determining whether any of the components of the mixtures you've testified to have saliva contributions from a source as opposed to blood?
Correct.
Now, I want to ask you some questions about the victim's clothing with respect to the D1S80 results. Do you have that in mind?
Yes, I'll pull up the notes.
We need to have a number for the slide presentation.
All right, next in order will be 1173. 1173.
And we have the fourth slide, which is slide D.
Mrs. Robertson, 1173.
Now, could we have slide E? Now, Ms. Montgomery, you conducted tests on 3 items of clothing, correct?
I conducted analysis on 2 items of clothing, and Steve Myers in our laboratory examined Nicole Simpson's dress.
Okay. And the 2 items that you looked at were the shirt and the pants of Ronald Goldman.
Correct.
And the dress was looked at by Steve Myers. That was Nicole Brown Simpson's dress.
Actually, the DNA was analyzed. The items were looked at by someone else.
Okay. And there were certain D1S80 results that came out of that analysis of those 3 items, correct?
Correct.
Now, I've indicated on my chart up there that I just color-coded it so it's a little easier to understand. We have slide F. Now, would you agree that from your results, yours and Steve Myers' results, there were 6 stains looked at on Nicole Brown Simpson's dress, 3 of which indicated a contribution by, possibly by, Ronald Goldman?
I'm referring to the report at this
Sure.
time. Yes, a total of 6 stains were examined, and 3 of the stains had a weaker contribution of a 24 allele.
Now, can we have slide G, please? Would you agree that there were 9 stains examined from Ronald Goldman's genes, 5 of which had an indication of an 18 allele, which is consistent with Nicole Brown Simpson?
Well, 4 of them had a weaker 18 allele. One of them had G6 from the left thigh area, had a possible trace 18, and that's what I had talked about earlier, where there was a darkening on the band, but it could not definitely be determined that it was a band.
Okay. And can we have slide H? Would you agree that there were 8 stains examined from Ronald Goldman's shirt, and all 8 of those stains showed an 18 allele consistent with Nicole Brown Simpson?
That's correct.
Now, can we have slide I, please? To summarize, there were a total of 23 stains tested on these 3 items of clothing, correct?
You added up the numbers that you...
Yes.
Okay, yes. I'll take your word for
And,
it.
I'm sorry, 16 of those stains, let's make that 15 since you said the one was just a trace, indicated mixtures containing possibly both victims.
Correct.
Now, is it also accurate to say that of all of those 23 stains, O.J. Simpson is excluded?
That's correct.
Now, would you agree that, can we go back to slide H, please? Would you agree that this is a fairly, withdraw. The shirt that was tested, these were stains that were taken from all over the shirt, correct?
I'll have to look at the notes.
Let me withdraw that one, I'll ask you another one. Did you do any of the cuttings on the shirt for these stains?
No, I did not.
And did you examine the shirt at all,
No.
ever? Did you see Gary Sims examining it at all?
No, I don't recall seeing it.
There was a considerable amount of blood on the shirt, was there not? Do you know that?
From some of the photos I've seen, it appeared to be.
Now, would you agree that one way that there could be such carryover from one victim to the other would be if the clothes came into contact in some way?
Objection, also speculation, argument.
Sustained.
Ms. Montgomery, can you tell us, in your opinion, how would you get the kind of mixed stains on both sets of clothing in so many different stains?
Objections, argumentative, may call for speculation, the way it's phrased.
Sustained.
Now, one of the stains on, I believe it was the shirt, was the substrate control, was it not? Actually, it wasn't the stain, it was the control.
Correct. There was a substrate control submitted, or a substrate control taken with that.
And do you know who made the cutting for the substrate control?
No, I do not.
Now, the substrate control, we've had a lot of testimony about what they are, but just very briefly, that's supposed to be an area of the shirt where there's no apparent stain, correct?
All right. It's best to take a substrate control that close to the stain in question, but without any biological fluid that's detectable, such as no blood present.
And would you agree that that substrate control showed the presence of alleles?
Yes, I believe it did.
And is that an indication that there can be enough blood or biological material in a sample to cause a result where you can't see it on the original sample?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence, if that's the case.
Overruled.
Could you rephrase that?
Yeah. There are 2 possible ways that could happen. One is the controls failed, correct? If you get a reading on a substrate control that's supposed to be empty.
Well, substrate control is to test what the background of that substrate is.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say it failed.
Well, failed was probably the wrong term. If it shows something, it indicates that there's DNA there.
Correct.
And this particular control showed that there was DNA in an area of the shirt where there didn't appear to be any stain.
Well, it showed an 18 allele in a region that was called a control.
Was that a yes?
Well, if it was taken as a control, then the individual wanted to see what the background of that material was. And it did show some activity in the background of that material.
But by definition, that would have been an area that didn't have any apparent stain.
Objection, that's argumentative.
Sustained.
Substrate control, is that supposed to be an area that doesn't show any apparent stain?
Sustained objection.
Overruled.
Yes, as I stated, the substrate control should be an area that's near the stain, but one that does not give you a presumptive a test for blood or anything such as that.
Now, I want to ask you some questions about the specific testing that you performed in this case. Do you have your notes with you?
Yes, I do. Excuse me.
Could you refer to page 5 of your
sorry.
notes?
Mrs. Robertson?
I'm sorry, what page was that?
5? Now, you, on, I believe it was August 6th of 1994, you started testing and you started to test the reference samples to see what the types were, correct?
Thank you. I believe the analysis began on August 4th of 1994.
And you amplified, or you tried to amplify Mr. Simpson's reference sample the first time, and you got no results, did you?
That's correct.
And that was a sample that you assumed came from Mr. Simpson because it was in the reference file labeled Mr. Simpson, correct?
Well, actually, that was a tube. Gary Sims examined the blood stains that were submitted pertaining to O.J. Simpson, Ronald Goldman, and Nicole Brown. And he took a portion of the blood stain and put it into a centrifuge tube. And then he gave me those tubes for the extraction process. And so the tube was labeled, I have it specifically, he labeled it with our case number, he labeled it with the evidence number, and then he labeled it O.J. Simpson.
Now, that was a sample that you expected to have bands show up, but nothing showed up, correct?
Yes, that's a sample, a reference blood stain from the individual.
Now, you had to do that one over again, didn't you?
Yes.
And that was because you got no bands the first time.
Yes, there was inhibition in that sample, so there was no visible bands on the D1S80 gel for O.J. Simpson's reference blood stain.
Now, inhibition is a term that I think we've heard it a couple of times, but that means that something happens with the DNA that the alleles don't amplify. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, it's during the amplification process. Somehow there's inhibition of the polymerase for the amplification of that specific allele.
And that can occur in samples other than reference samples too, can't it?
Oh, yes.
So in mixed samples, you can have inhibition and some of the alleles that might be there don't show up.
That's unlikely. When you have inhibition, the whole sample is inhibited. You don't just have inhibition of select alleles within an amplification.
I thought you just said a question or so ago that you could have alleles that don't show up because of inhibition.
Objection, that's argumentative.
Sustained.
So you're saying that if there's going to be any inhibition at all of the alleles are going to be inhibited?
Yes, you would have inhibition of the sample, not inhibition of one particular allele, but inhibition of the alleles in general.
Can you have partial inhibition in question mark?
I have not seen partial inhibition, no.
You can have differences in the efficiency of the amplification, can you not?
Well, the system has been optimized so you don't get any of this, what was the word you stated?
Inhibition?
Well, the system has been optimized so you don't have some of the partial amplification of alleles.
When you say it's been optimized, what do you mean?
It's been optimized both at the manufacturer and also through validation studies and in-house evaluation of the system. And this, as I was talking about, the twig dam requirements, this was one of the requirements that had to be addressed before D1S80 or any PCR marker can be used in the laboratory.
You're not aware of the phenomenon where a minor component of a mixture might get lost in the amplification process and not show up in typing because of the relative quantities of the two contributors?
Oh, now you're talking a different thing. Now what you're referring to is a stoichiometric effect, where if you have a minor component, that it's possible, depending on how much of that minor component's present, it's possible not to see the other contribution, but that would be at very low levels of DNA.
All right, would you spell stoichiometric for the reporter?
S-T-O, I believe I need to write it down.
S-T-O-C-H-I-O-M-E-T-R-I-C.
Correct.
I think.
We'll accept that.
The test in this case, some of the minor components of the mixtures involved very small amounts of DNA, didn't they?
Small relative to the initial DNA, but not small as I was referring to just in your previous question.
So the amounts that you used in this case, you would never expect to see an allele drop out in amplification?
Well, there were some samples where we amplified a small amount by DQ alpha, and I believe it was, I'd have to look at my notes, but I believe it was 400 picograms that was amplified. But as with D1S80, the smallest amount that was amplified, I believe, was 800, and typically we were amplifying well over 1 nanogram of DNA.
Now, you also had a problem with one of your standards in the D1S80 test that you performed in this case, did you not? I refer you to page 28 and 29 of your notes.
Yes, that's not, that does not have anything to do with the D1S80 system, though. And what that is a slot blot.
Well, the slot blot, you used the slot blot to determine the quantity that you were then going to use for the D1S80 gels, correct?
That's correct.
And one of the standards didn't work right, did it?
Right. On this one of the higher standards, it was a 40 nanogram that was outside of the range that we were even comparing our samples to. These are the standards that are used for comparison with our unknown DNAs. And one of the 40 nanograms was out of balance compared to some of the other standards that were on the gel.
And you had to discard that particular standard because of that, did you not?
Yes, I threw that standard away.
Did you do the slot blot over again?
No, I don't believe I did, because the 40 nanogram standard was irrelevant on the results of the other samples that were on the gel, because everything was at a lower level, and it wasn't, the 40 nanogram standard wasn't used as a comparison for the unknown samples.
So when something goes wrong with the test, you make some kind of an assessment that whether it really would affect your results or not in deciding whether you do something over again?
Yes, one needs to, if something such as that, where the 40 nanogram standard was less intense than the 20 nanogram standard, if something like that happens, one should troubleshoot it and determine what was happening. And if it appears that it had any bearing on, or any bearing on your results, then your analysis needs to be repeated. In this particular case, it was shown that the 40 nanogram standard was irrelevant because what I was looking at was low levels of DNA in the unknown samples. And so I was comparing at the lower levels, the lower level standards as opposed to the 40 nanogram standard. So basically that 40 nanogram standard did not even need to be placed on that gel.
So your answer is yes. Can we put that down as a yes?
Actually, you'd have to re-ask the question, please.
You also had a problem. I'll pass on that one. You also had a problem with the Rockingham glove, didn't you?
Connection vague is the problem.
Sustain.
Refer you to page 46 of your notes. First time you did it, you had a problem, didn't you?
Oh, yes, that gel was reanalyzed.
And what happened was the ladder was smeared and distorted, and you had some crossover from one lane to another on the gel, correct?
Yes, and this demonstrates that when something's unacceptable in our laboratory, we do reanalysis of the samples. If there's ever any question, then we reanalyze samples.
Now, let me refer you to page 62 of your notes. One of the standards that's used on these gels, and let me ask if we could have some photographs marked. Actually, let me use one of the prosecution's exhibit 275H. On the Elmo, please. I just want to use this for illustrative purposes. We count three lanes over from the left.
I'll need to come down there to
Okay.
look at it.
Three lanes over from the left is called the 1 nanogram control lane, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And that is a known sample that has genotype 1831, correct?
Yes, that's an additional standard that's placed on the gel. It's provided within the Roche kit. And as you can see, the first lane, if I had the little telestrator, I can
Well,
point to
I'll
it.
show you another picture. We can highlight the other picture.
Okay.
But that is supposed to be, that's supposed to come up 1831 each time that you do it, correct?
Well, that's an additional control. The control that must,
Excuse me, Ms. Montgomery, question was, is that what comes up?
I'm sorry, what?
That 1 nanogram control, that's one of the controls that you use, and that's supposed to light up at 18 and 31 if your test is being done properly.
Yes and no. That is an additional control, but the control in question that must respond properly is the first one in that after the ladder, and that's the 4 nanogram control of an 1831.
And the bands on the 1 nanogram control, should they be of equal intensity?
Yes, yes, they should, but the one in question is actually the 4 nanogram.
No, the one I'm asking about is the 1 nanogram.
Right.
Should those be of equal intensity?
One would want them to be of equal intensity, yes.
Well, you can resume your seat, please. I believe you indicated on direct that your system has been optimized so that bands with equal amounts of DNA will show up with equal intensity. Did I hear that right?
You're correct.
Ms. Montgomery, I showed you a series of pictures, or I gave them to you at lunch for you to look at to see if they were accurate pictures of some of the films that we've already seen, correct?
Correct.
And did you agree that the packet I gave you was these were accurate pictures of your films?
Yes, they were.
Your Honor, I need to have these marked. Let me ask you just to look at these again, just to satisfy yourself that they're the same.
All right, Mr. Blasier, I think these would be 1174. How many do you have?
There are 7 pictures. We have photo 96. And this is, Your Honor, what was the first number?
1174.
Now, Ms. Montgomery, this is just a picture of the film that you showed us that contains the Bronco samples number 30, 31, and 293, correct?
Yes.
And I'm going to highlight, or I'm going to magnify the 1 nanogram control lane.
Mr. Blasier, are we going to go through all of these at this time? Would it be easier if I just stayed down at the...
Well, I think you should be able to see these on the monitor. Now, you agree that the lane there on the right is the 1 nanogram control lane?
Yes.
Now, you can refer to page 70 of your notes. Would you agree that when you read this, you read the 18 band of that 1 nanogram control as being brighter than the 31 band? It's a little difficult to see in the picture. That's why I referred you to your notes.
You said page 70 of my notes?
Yes.
Could you show me the full scale of this?
Of the picture? Sure.
Yeah, it's difficult looking at it out of context. Yes, and that's not page 70 of my notes.
Okay. Do you have the page of your notes that shows your worksheet for items 30, 31, and 293? Let me show you my copy.
Actually, yes, that's page 44.
Page 44.
Yes.
Would you agree that your notes indicate that the 18 is more intense than the 31?
No, I disagree with that.
Okay.
My notes don't indicate that at all.
All right, take a look at page 70 of your notes. Take that one down. You looking at your notes?
Yes, I am.
That was, that's your run sheet from which samples?
Page 70, this is AG, Analytical Gel 267. And this is a composite of many samples, quality control samples, positive controls from different amplification days, and also two controls two control samples relating to the Bronco, and those are DNA 17, DNA is our DOJ number, 17, which is what, LAPD 30, and then also DNA 18 control, which is LAPD 31.
So that's is that a different run of the same samples that we showed in the last picture?
Well, the first picture you showed was the actual samples that were taken, the samples that related to the controls of the Bronco. They were samples, DNA 17 and DNA 18. Those are two Bronco samples. And then on the next gel, the one you're referring to now, AG 267, those are the controls that go with the Bronco samples on that previous gel.
Okay, and those controls were done at a different time from the samples to which they belonged.
Yes, there's only limited space on a gel. You can't fit, sometimes you can't fit all the samples.
Well, in many of these runs, you did put the control samples with the samples to which they belonged, did you not?
Yes, when there's enough space, I'll put as many samples as I can on the gel, but if there's not enough space, then you're limited with the number you can put on the gel, and you'll have to put it on a separate gel.
Now, would you agree on your run for the controls, page 70 of your notes, that you determined that the 18 band in your standard, 1 nanogram standard line, was greater than the 31 band?
Whoops.
Mr. Harmon, you want to give us a hand here?
Dropping notes.
Is
Thank you.
that all?
We don't want any missing pages. No, the positive control that goes with those control samples function properly.
My question was, did you note in your run sheet that 18 was brighter than 31?
Section states which control.
1 nanogram controlling.
That's fine.
Oh, okay, the 1 nanogram control. Now, this pertains to a different amplification. This doesn't pertain to the controls that were put with the Bronco. And yeah, there was an 18, a weak 18, and the 31, there was a hint at the 31. There was a difference in the intensity of those alleles.
And your 4 nanogram control line also had a difference in intensity, did they not? Did it not?
Yes, it did. There was a gel problem on that region of the gel. That was the farther region of the gel, the last 4 lanes.
That's not the way those controls are supposed to work, is it? They're supposed to be of equal intensity, aren't they?
Yes, we've optimized the amplification so you get equal intensity of those alleles. This was a gel
Somehow this
effect.
one didn't get optimized.
No, this was a gel effect. This isn't an amplification effect.
So there are some effects on the gel that can cause there to be different intensities of bands in the same lane.
Yes, I mean, that was demonstrated on that particular sample. On those samples towards the further region of the gel, that there was a discrepancy between those alleles. And it's a gel it's a gel polymerization problem.
Now, you also indicated on your worksheet for those controls that your 31 allele was smeared and not well defined. Is that another manifestation of the gel problem?
I'm sorry, which sample?
The same one we were looking at, page 70.
Yes, and that gave you an indication that that region of the gel wasn't functioning properly.
Now, let me refer you to page 62 of your notes. And that was the run for the positive controls for what? Actually, those are SOC samples, are they not?
Yes, they are.
And you have both some controls and some of the evidence samples on that run, correct?
Correct.
And you had a problem on that run as well, did you not, with your 31 band?
No, well, that wasn't a problem because on this run, 4 nanograms. No, that wasn't a problem.
It didn't come out the way it's supposed to come out, did it?
The 1 nanogram control had the 31 band was darker than the 18 band, and that's for the 1 nanogram control. The 4 nanogram control gave equal intensity to the 2 alleles.
The 1 nanogram control is supposed to also give you bands of equal intensity, correct?
Well, the 1 nanogram control, you would like to have equal intensity of those 2 alleles, yes.
And
But
when- Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. There are situations where you don't get equal intensity of those 2 alleles. And that's why at lower levels of DNA amplification, you need to be cautious with your interpretation. That's why you strive to amplify more than a nanogram of DNA.
Doesn't that mean that with small concentrations of DNA, you can't really make very precise assessments about band intensity vis-a-vis who the contributor was?
What you're saying with when you have a low level of DNA, that it's difficult to tell which bands go to which bands? Is that what you're saying?
You have to be much more cautious in terms of trying to determine who contributed what bands when you're talking about low levels of DNA.
If you're talking about very low levels of DNA, yes.
Now, we talked about you're being unable to amplify Mr. Simpson's standard, or reference sample the first time, problems with the standard, the glove that you had to redo, the gel problems that you've had, and the 31 control bands that we've talked about. Is this number of problems typical for the D1S80 system?
Sustained Fred's question.
Do you ordinarily have these types of problems with D1S80, or in this case, did you have more problems than usual?
Sustained.
These kinds of things going wrong, is this typical of this system?
With the amplification, that's a PCR phenomenon, the fact that the reference sample did not amplify. And as far as the other things, the 1 nanogram control is used, or the 1 nanogram standard is used as an additional control. The main control that we're concerned with is the 4 nanogram, and we want to see equal intensity to those 4 nanogram controls. The system, I have all the confidence in this system and with the results of this system. So if that answers your question.
I can strike all of that as non-responsive.
Well,
Was that a yes or a no? Are these the kinds of things that happen routinely with the D1S80 system?
for Fred's question.
The things we've just been talking about, are these typical of the D1S80 system?
They're not typical, no.
So more things like we've described, happened with respect to this case than you would expect to see in other D1S80 cases.
Objections are denied.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Okay, you said it's not typical. Would you expect in D1S80 system on a particular case there to be more problems like this or less?
Objections not denied.
Or will.
Over 20 gels were run in this particular case, which is more than most cases. And as far as the problems, there were no significant problems. There was reanalysis on a few of the gels, but nothing was significant to cause problems with this result. There were not more problems seen in this particular case than seen with D1S80 analysis, and they weren't major problems.
So when you said that this was not typical, you were indicating that in other cases you're likely to see more types of things like this?
Objections are denied. Ask for an answer.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Well, you said this wasn't typical, and I asked you, are there more things, problem areas, let's call them, here than in a typical case? And I don't think you answered that. Could you answer that?
Objection. It's compound. It's argumentative. Calls for speculation.
Or will.
By typical doesn't mean, it's not routine that you see some of these phenomenons occurring. That's what I meant by it's not typical.
So in ordinary cases, you don't see these kinds of things happening. Is that what you said?
In ordinary cases. I'm not quite sure what you mean.
We have photo 100, please. And this will be 1175.
1175.
Now, Ms. Montgomery, could you take a look at this and tell me which run this is? This is, I'll tell you, it's AG 184, correct?
Correct.
And this was the run where you did samples from the Bundy drops, correct?
Yes, it was.
Now, on this sample, you did both samples of those drops as well as some of the controls, did you not?
Correct.
And the writing at the top is, that just identifies what's in the lane below it, correct?
Yes, that's, actually that's Dr. Blake's writing in his photographs.
But do you concur that he's properly labeled the lanes?
Yes, he has.
Now, the last two lanes over here, I've got the little arrow on. The first one is DOJ 24, and what is that?
DOJ 24, as written here, is what we call DNA 24. Dr. Blake tended to call our samples DOJ, and in-house we called them DNA. And that relates to LAPD number 50 control.
Now, that's a substrate control for a Bundy drop, correct?
I believe it is, yes.
And that shouldn't have any lanes in it, should it? Any bands in it?
Correct.
What is that, Ms. Montgomery?
It's not a band. That's, yeah, if you look at the, yes, if you look at the original gel, you can see that there's some blip or glitch I'm not sure if it's actually cut out of the gel or not. That's right in between the two lanes, but it's not a band. It's definitely not a band.
Would you agree that if that were a band, that means that your control, the substrate control, showed the presence of DNA that shouldn't be there?
Sustained.
Now, how do you tell the difference between something like that that looks like a band and something that is a very faint band?
Well, first of all, this is right in between two lanes. And samples are loaded into the lane, and you would see a distinct banding pattern within that well where they were loaded. As I'm holding up a gel to demonstrate for you, this is where the wells, where samples are loaded. Can you see this? And there's a separation between each where each sample's loaded. That blip right in there is a diffuse, smeary blip in the gel, and it could either be, like I said, it could be just where the gel's been darkened right in that area, and when it was photoed, it was captured by that. But it's definitely not a band. It's not a distinct thickened line.
That's not something you expect to see, is it?
Well, you wouldn't expect to see it, but it's not anything that concerns me.
It indicates that something is going on there that shouldn't be going on there. Isn't that accurate?
No, I think that's inaccurate. Accurate to say that.
Now, if we describe this as having a band-like appearance, would you concur with that? Looks like it could have been a band?
Yeah, it has there's some darkening in that region of the gel.
And it's at an allele, it's at a level on the ladder different from any of the people that you've tested in connection with this case.
Correct.
And it's, I believe it's a 15 allele, isn't it? If that is a band, that band-like appearance is a band, it's a 15.
Or will.
Well, if you're saying it's a band, then that would be in between that 14 repeat and the 16 repeat. So that would be the 15 repeat.
Now, this might be a good time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our break. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. We'll be in recess for 15 minutes.
Ms. Montgomery, I just want to clarify that the item, the band-like thing down here that we've been talking about corresponds to the lane at the top for the substrate control, does it not? 50C,
Yes,
and for a Bundy drop.
correct.
Take that down.
Well, I'm sorry. Actually, you should also include that extraction blank in the second, or in the lane next to the ladder, because since it's right in between those two lanes, you need to address both those lanes.
So it could be either one, correct?
Well, I mean, that little artifact's right in between the two.
Now, the extraction blank shouldn't show anything either, should it?
Correct.
Okay, take it down. Now, I want to ask you a couple of questions about the D1S80 system in general that you talked about on direct. You indicated that it was a discrete allele system, correct?
Correct.
And you indicated that it was, everybody matches some of the bands on the ladder.
No, I don't believe I stated it that way.
What did you state with respect to the ladder encompassing all the possible alleles?
Okay, the ladder is a composite ladder, and that means that from the 14 allele and then the 15 through the 41 allele are present on that. There are alleles that are greater than the 41, and there's the possibility that a 15 allele has been seen, but it's very rare, and so it's not added into the ladder.
So there are alleles in this system that don't show up on this ladder, correct? Because the ladder's too small.
There are some very rare alleles, like I said, greater than 41, and then also the 15 allele that are not on this ladder.
And those are alleles that could be present in someone's DNA that would not show up in this system, correct?
No, that's not correct. They would not have a corresponding ladder allele to call them. If there was something greater than the top 41 allele, you would see a band up there. And I have seen bands greater than 41, and this is very rare. And so anything that's greater than 41 is called greater than 41, and it can't be lined up with any allele ladder. And it happens so infrequently that the company doesn't feel it's necessary to have ladder alleles up in that region, which I agree with.
But the point, you indicated that alleles don't run off the gel. There are alleles in this system that do run off the ladder in the sense that you can't measure them, correct? With the ladder.
Correct, I just stated that, yes.
And now when you say a discrete allele system, is a good analogy there comparing a digital watch with an analog watch that goes around? A discrete allele system is like a digital watch, meaning that you're either at 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, you can't be in between? Is that what you mean by discrete allele?
You could use that analogy.
And a clock, for instance, is more like an RFLP system where you can have alleles spread out from the top to the bottom of the gel. They're not going to be at discrete positions.
Continuous. Or another analogy would be shoe size. When you go in to buy shoes, they have 8.5, 9, 9.5, but you might be in between that 8.5 and 9. So for RFLP, that's how RFLP is addressed. Whereas with D1S80, each person would fit perfectly into that.
And that would be because that everybody who is a 25 has the same sequence of DNA at that location as anybody else that's a 25.
Well, they have the same number of repeats. So an individual that's a 25 would have 20 repeats, or an individual that's a 25 would have 25 continuous repeats of that particular sequence. There can be subtle variation, and an individual that would be an 18 would have 18 continuous repeats of that region.
Well, when you say there can be subtle variations, what you're saying is that there can be people who show up as a 25, for instance, that have a different sequence as someone else that shows up as a 25, correct?
Oh, yes, that's possible. What we're looking at is length differences. We're not looking at sequence differences with this system.
So two people that come up as a 25 would match in your system, but if they had a different sequence, they are different people, aren't they?
Yes, that's true.
So your system does not have the ability, even though you call it a discrete allele system, to identify precisely the sequence in a particular band.
Right, we're looking at length differences.
And unlike PCR DQ alpha, which does identify specific sequences of DNA, correct?
Correct.
So this, in a sense, is this aspect of the system is closer to the RFLP system, where you're estimating sequences, in a sense, correct?
Well, we're not estimating sequences. We're not looking at the sequence. We're looking at the length differences between individuals, how many repeats they have. It's a 16 base pair repeat. So an individual that's an 18 has 18 of these 16 base pair repeats. And they would have a repeat sequence that's, say, this long, whereas an individual that's a 25 would have repeat sequences that are even longer. The same repeat sequence, the same number of repeats, but just a different length.
The point is, different alleles would come up as the same 25, 24, or whatever, and they'd be different alleles, wouldn't they?
If there is a sequence difference between two individuals, they can run to the same position, but it's the length difference we're looking at, not the sequence difference.
Now, there's also reports in the literature about bands in the D1S80 system not lining up correctly with the ladder, correct?
That's correct.
And there have been reports in the literature of bands going to a place in the ladder that's different from what the true sequence is, correct?
Going to a place in the ladder different than the true...
I'm sorry.
repeating your question to myself. If there's a sequence difference, it's possible that there could be just a very subtle variation, but it'll still line up with the composite ladder allele that's adjacent to it, provided in the Roche kit.
Well, the literature indicates that there are situations where it's so far out of alignment with the ladder that it can be confused with the band above it.
Projections aren't imagining these bands.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Are you aware of the literature that talks about the mobility of bands being such that you can mistype which rung of the ladder you're on because the band is somewhere in the middle?
Yes, that was early on during the development of the system, and what happened is some of the laboratories were trying to use their conventional serology.
I'm going to object as being non-responsive at this point.
Sustained. Restate your question, Counsel. Mobility of bands.
I think she answered with the first part of her answer. I'm satisfied with the first part.
All right.
That was an explanation.
No,
Could you read it back? I think you'll see it's an explanation.
Counsel, you can cover that on redirect. Proceed.
Now, this system also has a characteristic that if samples are degraded, you can lose bands, correct?
You could lose you could get no results with degraded samples, yes.
You can also selectively lose bands, can't you?
At very, very low levels, it's unusual to lose just
Is that a
one.
yes?
Objection, that's argument.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
You can lose, well, let me rephrase it. The ladder that's in the D1S80 system comprises fragment lengths that go from about, 300 base pairs up to a couple thousand maybe?
It ranges from a little under 400 base pairs up to over 800 base pairs.
And when a sample degrades, it generally starts to break down. The larger fragments get broken up first. There still may be shorter fragments while the degradation process is going on, correct?
Well, it's a random act that's occurring, the degradation of DNA, and that's just cutting at various locations on the genome.
So you're understanding that when degradation occurs and DNA fragments are cut up, they're cut up randomly in the sense that, well, let me rephrase that. When you start chopping up the DNA, you lose.
All right, let's have it quiet in the courtroom, please.
When you start chopping up the DNA, it gets cut into successively smaller fragments, correct?
Yes, it does.
And as it degrades, if it fully degrades, you may not see any bands at all, correct?
Correct.
And as it degrades further, the bands that are longer, that represent longer sequences, you no longer can see, correct?
That's correct.
So you can lose the upper bands of a genotype, for instance, if somebody is an 1830